Okay. Show of hands, I can see. Who here has organized your life around a single burning passion? A sense of a clear and definite calling? Oh, look at all those hands. Oh, how I've longed to be you. I've spent countless hours looking deep into my heart, trying to find that bright, shining North Star that would point me in a clear direction. But instead, the longer I gazed within, the more I saw what looked more like this, a whole universe of possibilities. I had the sense that, like Walt Whitman, I contain multitudes, full of complexity and contradiction, potentials and gifts, including an imagination that allowed me to dream myself into 100 different careers and then just as easily dream myself out of them. I spent a lot of time not only feeling pretty confused by myself, but also pretty sure that my inability to stake out a clear path forward was a sign of some kind of terrible character flaw. Unfocused, flaky, too greedy, too much, too messy, afraid of commitment? And this long-standing sense of inner incoherence actually led me to a fascination with how it is that people actually figure out what to do with their lives. It seemed to me that those of you with that single burning passion, in a sense, have no choice to make. You're compelled in a particular direction. But how the heck do the rest of us pick a path? On what basis do we choose? The path of least resistance? What our parents or grandparents did? Or maybe we accidentally stumble into something and hope it sticks? In my 20s, I tried choosing based on a desire for security and respectability and an incomplete understanding of the kind of creator I am. I knew I was an uplifter, one of those people that can't learn anything without immediately wanting to teach it to someone else. In fact, my family members who are here will testify that I have been known to teach some things that aren't exactly true, just for the joy of explaining. I also knew I was a thinker, someone who loved social theory and exploring big ideas, and an analyst. My wonderful liberal arts education had taught me well how to take in a huge volume of information and distill an argument about its essential meanings. And so at 23, I entered a PhD program to become an academic, a social scientist. I believed that being a professor would allow me to express my gifts and, along the way, provide that security and respect and a defined thing to be. And so here I am in the pinnacle of my academic career. I was about 5 or 6 years in at this point, and I had been granted a prestigious residential fellowship at the University of California, Irvine, to hang out with these lovely women and talk about feminist methodology and epistemology. And the gig came with a sterile little furnished apartment near the campus, and time to write my dissertation, and the opportunity to network with and learn from these marvelous professors and graduate students. Oh, it was awesome on paper, except I hated it, all of it. I was completely and utterly miserable. In fact, if you look closer, you will see that while my colleagues were looking relaxed and openly smiling, I am looking quite stiff, and my half-hearted smile doesn't extend anywhere near my eyes. This is because I was falling apart. I was crying all the time. I had started having panic attacks in bookstores and libraries, my lifelong havens. And out of a sense of overwhelming pressure to produce some writing worthy of those shelves, and the simultaneous knowledge that I wouldn't actually want to read anything I was being trained to write, I felt utterly lost, a little bored, ambivalent, alienated, and unable to write a word. All of which was horrendously confusing, not only to me, but to these lovely people around me, because I was doing something that made perfect sense on paper. This picture, in fact, tells the story of the beginning of the end of my academic career. This was when the scales finally began to tip, and the fear of leaving the security of the university environment began to be outweighed by my deep unhappiness at staying in. So after a dismal performance as a fellow, I stepped out of school for a year to reassess and pull myself together. And in that time, in search of healing, I carved out a little craft table in a damp garage under the house next to the washer and dryer, and I began to allow myself to mess around with silly stuff that I had been always inexplicably drawn to. Stuff like sequins and miniature vegetables and paints and papers and glues. I tapped into a strong need to to create as an expressionist, someone who was eager to share something original and authentic and true with the world, and a maker, someone who is deeply joyful in moments where my hands are busy creating objects of quality and beauty. And adding these elements back into my life was like pouring water on a severely dehydrated plant. It brought me back to life and restored those parts of me that were crumbling for lack of acknowledgement and attention. It even turned out that in those hours and minutes I spent as an expressionist maker, that I found myself able to connect in a new way to something much larger than myself. In that time, I learned that art making is, for me, a wellness practice. It keeps me out of depression. It allows me to make meaning of my world. It allows me to express ideas and perceptions and understandings that no academic paper could ever approach. And if this were a story about finding a singular burning passion and living happily ever after, my talk would be done now. But it isn't, and it's not. Because remember all those other parts of my creative self? Well, they were still there. Still very real, valid parts of me, even if becoming a professor wasn't going to be the right vehicle for their expression. So I had more exploring to do. For the next decade, I continued with my foundational creative practice, even if only for 15 minutes a day, making shrines and shadow boxes, and keeping that going while I tested out a whole bunch of different ways to combine my strengths and make a living. But through the parade of jobs that followed, I'd learned a ton, but I never felt that inner clicking sound I was waiting to hear, that sense of being wholeheartedly at home in a career as connected and passionate as the people around me seemed to be. And then, along the way, in 2003, I learned about an emerging new field called creativity coaching. And I got certified to help other people, artists and writers, overcome their creative blocks and accomplish their creative goals. And in the other students in that program, I found for the first time a sense of, maybe this is my tribe. So now I had two anchor points: art making as a non-negotiable wellness practice, and creativity coaching as a way to express my need to help and teach. But my pesky thinker self was not content with what I had been taught about creativity and the creating process. I kept returning to those original questions about how to figure out what to do with one's life. I was starting to see the clear connection between creativity and life purpose. But what about those people who are creative in more than one way? It seemed to me that we were approaching creativity with the wrong questions. Most of the time we asked either, are you creative? Which is completely unhelpful, because if you're a human being, the answer is always yes. Or we ask, how creative are you? Which is unhelpful, because it keeps our focus on the goal of getting more creative and away from the real issues of what it takes to orchestrate a life that sustains and supports the fullness of our creative selves. I realized that if we were going to do that, we needed to step back and start with a new question: how are you creative? With the assumption that each of us has a signature combination of answers. So about 5 years ago, I went deep into thinker analyst mode, and I spent a couple years researching this question of, in what ways does creativity express itself through us? What are all the different ways of being creative? And I had great fun looking around at people in Langley, and people in my family, and my friends, and reading the news, and reading obituaries, and reading memoirs of highly creative people. And out of that, I distilled a set of 25 distinct creative modes that I believe are present in different combinations for each of us. And then I shifted into my beloved maker mode, and I spent another year in the studio illustrating each of those 25 modes, which allowed me then to create a card deck that allows people to play with it in a very tangible way. So you've seen 6 of those illustrations as I've been discussing my own creative constellation, and here are the other 19. So today, I'm feeling my way into another chapter. I have at last found a project which beautifully and harmoniously integrates my full creative constellation, and now I'm figuring out how to bring it to others who, like me, may feel confused or overwhelmed by their own multiplicity. Through workshops, gatherings, webinars, and individual coaching. You know, we all have moments of confusion and indecision, and of course these uncomfortable times are great learning times too. But my hope is that people like me and all of you who didn't raise your hand on my first question can be spared the prolonged self-doubt that comes from feeling too flaky or too messy or too much, and the sense of failure that comes when you find it impossible to pick a lane. My hope is that we can all claim our diverse gifts, honor our complexity as a strength, and our excesses as our assets, and simply get on with our life's work, dialing in on those projects and activities that bring us the greatest satisfaction and aliveness and meaning and joy. I know for sure that the world needs all of who we are, and that when we cease our inner battles, it frees us up to make the contributions we know in our hearts we are capable of. So if you are one of those people who finds yourself saying in that self-deprecating way, someday I'll figure out what I'm going to do when I grow up, I would urge you to ask yourself instead simply, what do I want to create next? And then go do that using your whole creative constellation as your guide. Thank you.